te whānau, nau mai, haere mai ki tō tātou wā kāinga. Welcome everybody, it's so awesome to have you tuning in today. Welcome to our home, this is now your home, which happens to be online today. But we're so stoked that you're tuning in today. We're going to pray to start with. Kia inoi tātou. He honore, karoria ki te atua, he maunga rongo ki te whenua, he whakaaro pai ki ngā tāngata katoa. Hanga e te atua, he ngākau hau, ki roto, ki tēnā o mātou, whakatongia tō wairua tapu, hei āwhina, hei tohu i a mātou, hei ako hoki i ngā mahi mō tēnei rā. Āmini. So yesterday marks 181 years since Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, was signed here in New Zealand, which is such a significant day in our country. And so I'm so excited today to introduce our awesome guest, Dr. Alistair Reese. He's a local man here in Tauranga Moana, a farmer, right? And he's really passionate about our land and our people here in Aotearoa. He's also a historian, he's studied history, theology and tikanga Māori, and so I'm so excited for everybody to hear from you today, Alistair. So excited. So we've actually called our conversation today Tāngata Whenua and Tāngata Tiriti, a bicultural conversation about the history of Aotearoa and the gospel. And so I thought a really good place to start would maybe be, Alistair, if you can tell us a little bit about those two terms, Tāngata Whenua and Tāngata Tiriti. What do they mean?
Kia ora, Maren. Kia ora koutou. He nori ki te atua, mā ngā rongo ki te whenua, whakaaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Ko rangiuru te maunga, ko kaituna te awa, ko Himalaya te waka. Ko Waitangi te kawanata, ko ihu karaiti te tangata me te atua, te hei Māori ora. So it's my greeting to you all, and wonderful to be here. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about these really important issues that are before us at this time. So returning to your question around Tāngata Tiriti and Tāngata Whenua, what do these two terms mean? The word Tāngata Whenua is probably quite well known, and literally it means people of the land, and it really refers to, for us it refers to Māori, the people who first peopled the land, so we could call them the first people of the land. It refers to where Māori received their identity from. So if they live in a particular location, they draw so much of their identity from the whenua, from the land on which they dwell. It also defines for them something of their tūranga waiwai, the place where they can stand. So Tāngata Whenua is it's an identity term.
Yeah.
Probably less well known as the term Tāngata Tiriti. It's a term that I love, and it was quite possibly coined by Sir Eddie Jury, who was a High Court judge and from Ngāti Kahungunu. And in a speech that he made many years ago, he was speaking to his fellow Tāngata Whenua, and he said that we need to understand that Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi, is a treaty not only for Māori, but it is also a treaty for Tāngata Tiriti, the other people of the treaty. So literally it means the people of the treaty, and it's a term that's used in juxtaposition to Tāngata Whenua, and it means really, it refers to and gives an identity to all non-Māori who dwell in Aotearoa New Zealand, who are here legitimately and morally because of the Treaty of Waitangi, or Te Tiriti of Waitangi.
Yeah. Amazing.
So just one other thing on that is it refers not only to Pākehā, but it refers to all non-Māori. So that in a way it signifies the two identities or the two people groups within the treaty.
Awesome. Thank you. That's really amazing. Cool. So when we're thinking about the history of our country, I feel like I've been in these conversations or overheard these conversations where people are like, we just need to move forward and stop thinking about the past and let it go and go about our way. But as a historian, can you talk a little bit about why you feel like it's so important that we actually embrace and learn about the history of our country and of the gospel in our country and of the treaty and all those kind of aspects?
Sure. So the past is important for many reasons. History, in a sense, forms or helps form our identity. Not only that, the past also forms our reality of today. It also reveals and forms the context in which we live. If we are a faith community and people of the book, we should just inherently be people who are enthused about the past, because we would understand, as the scriptures reveal, to know something of the past informs our present. So, for example, it's really important that as Christians we know that in the first century a new covenant was sealed and signed in the blood of Jesus between God and his people. That's a very important historical reality.
Yes.
And it's very difficult to actually even understand anything about Christianity unless you understand something about, for example, that historical fact.
Yes.
And of course, if you look through the scriptures, probably 1/3 at least, off the top of my head, of the scriptures is an historical document. So there's lots of reasons why that is the case. But moving into the things that we're talking about today, the past of Aotearoa New Zealand helps us to understand where we live now. What is the context of which we're living? So we don't live in a vacuum.
No.
We're not some people who have just arrived out of space and just sit in here in this kind of amorphous place. We live in a context. It's important for us to understand that in 1840, all those years ago, as you have said, a covenant was signed between the British Crown, who represented all the new settlers, and Tāngata Whenua and Māori. So a covenant was signed between those two, and what's more, that covenant, or the Treaty, Te Tiriti, was actually mediated and to a large extent influenced by our spiritual tupuna, our spiritual ancestors, who were people like Henry Williams, or Karuwha, Four Eyes, as they call him, first man that they saw with glasses. So this covenant and historical document is here in the land. It's an historical reality. And if we look through the scriptures, again, referring to your question about why is the past important, we will see that in God's view, in God's eyes, people are judged in the way that they live their lives on account of things that have happened in the past. So people were looked at by God in relationship to, for example, the Noah covenant, what we would call the first covenant of the Old Testament, and now the new covenant. And we see that in human terms, those covenants, or those are also outworked in things like marriage covenants and political covenants or treaties. So they're taken very seriously in the scripture. So that's a short answer.
It's very good.
To your question about at least why, as people of faith, is the past important to us.
That's great. I love that. So I guess with that in mind, I'd actually love it if you could share a little bit of the history of our country as it kind of relates to the treaty and the gospel, and maybe something that obviously we haven't got a truckload of time, but like give us a little glimpse into the story that we're a part of.
Yeah, I love that phrase you just used. You mentioned Karuwha, this one of the organisations that I'm a part of.
Yeah.
And the byline of Karuwha is know the story that you are a part of.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I think unfortunately for many New Zealand Christians, they haven't felt a part of the story. We have felt very much a part of the story of the book, but we haven't also understood that we're actually a part of the story of the place in which we live.
Yeah.
And so we have some rights and some responsibilities because of the places in which we dwell and the time in which we dwell. I think another reality that is often overlooked and hasn't probably been well aired is the role that our spiritual forefathers have played in the formation of this nation of Aotearoa New Zealand. And I talked before about Karuwha, or about Henry Williams. Now he was probably he was the most significant missionary that arrived in New Zealand in 1826. He actually arrived here in Tauranga, had quite a few dealings with Tauranga. Beautiful story, story, we could tell it another time. I won't get distracted on that. But Henry Williams was living in Paihia amongst Northern Māori, and he had over many years formed a relationship, particularly with Ngāpuhi, with the different iwi up there. And in the early 20s, in the midst of the musket wars, in the midst of the arrival of all kinds of less than salubrious settlers from Europe.
Nice, yes.
Yes, there was quite a lot of problems that were happening up there.
Yeah.
And Māori turned to people like Henry Williams and said, these issues are facing us. You know, how can we go about resolving some of them? And so from a very early time, particularly the Church Missionary Society, which was the Anglican Methodist missionaries, in their relationship with Māori, began to be an intermediary with the British Crown, because it was mainly British settlers that were coming at the time. And there were two very significant things that came out of that relationship. The first one is a document which is called He Whakaputanga, or the Declaration of Independence, which was signed in 1835, and that was signed between a man called Busby and again some northern tribes. It was also witnessed by Henry Williams and two other missionaries. So in a way you could see that it was the role of the church that facilitated the foundational documents that form our nation. And of course, 5 years later, with the arrival of Lieutenant Governor Hobson, who was, in a sense, welcomed into the land again by missionaries, because he relied upon them in order to make contact with New Zealand Māori. So people like Henry Williams were the first ones that Hobson contacted in order to help even finish drafting the treaty, to translate the treaty. Then they used all of their networks to welcome rangatira from across the Motu to the north, to the actual occasion of the signing of the treaty on the 5th and the 6th of February. It was Henry Williams who stood and translated for Hobson and basically proclaimed before God that this document, this treaty that was before them, was an honourable thing. And he stood as a trusted friend of Māori, as a churchman, as a proselytizer of the gospel, and saying, I'm commending this to you. So he used everything that he could to convince Māori to sign.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of toing and froing around that. It wasn't
Yeah.
all something that was instantly received. So he, in a sense, used his power of persuasion. And there were other Northern Māori who had become Christian, like Pataone and Heke and others like that,
Yeah.
who were the first to say, yes, we'll go for it. After their signing of that treaty, the treaty was then taken around the country, and from my understanding, at every place apart from maybe one, the signings were again mediated by the local missionaries. They were the ones that invited rangatira to come, and they witnessed it. So here in Tauranga as well, the same thing. Archdeacon Brown and others were the ones that used their influence to invite Tauranga Māori chiefs to sign the treaty. So there is a deep investment of the church in the signing and also the covenantal nature of the treaty. And I think I'll just finish on this. There's probably something that hasn't been well understood is this covenantal nature of the treaty. It's been talked about as a political treaty, but actually Northern Māori themselves understood that this was more than just a contract. It had a spiritual connotation, and they called it that. And for example, they stood and said, this is as the very word of God.
Wow.
And so that's the kind of the seriousness, the sobriety around the signing of this treaty. And I think as people of faith who have a hopefully somewhat of an understanding of the nature of covenants, that we have much to contribute to this conversation. And unfortunately, Merrin, in my view, we have actually neglected that. It's actually the neglect of a responsibility that our spiritual forefathers initiated and facilitated and mediated.
Yeah, it's really good. So I guess, how do we respond to that? Like this kind of piece of history that you've just sort of shared with us, like that's a really powerful kind of a thing. Can you talk a little bit about how we can respond to that? Like what's next? How do we take a next step in our, like as a group of people, as a community of people, as a church, but also as individuals? Like what can we do next?
I think there's a lot of steps to that. I think one of the first steps is individuals and groups need to be convinced in their heart that this is actually something that's significant. Something that they need to grapple with. And so it's actually a theological question, firstly. You could ask this question, is God into this? I think that's the first question, sincerely, because if we're disciples of Christ, that we're about the Father's business, and we're about only the Father's business. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we need to grapple with that theological question, and I referred to it a little bit before, and very lightly around the relationship of covenants, the past, and God looking on, and judgment, and all those sorts of things. So if people can follow that journey along and say, yes, God is into things like, well, marriage, for example, covenant of marriage. Perhaps he's into covenants that are political as well, and follow that line. So there's some inquiry, I think, that needs to take place, and I think church leaders have a responsibility to discern these things and to grapple with them. And then if they, like you, obviously, are convinced that this is a legitimate preoccupation or activity for Christians, then we should pursue it. And so in the pursuing of it, again, theological issues like the issue of mission. What is mission about? You know, where do we do mission? What is the nature of mission? So these are, again, wonderful questions that I love to explore. The relationship between text and context, that's our activity. You know, so we understand something of the text,
Yeah.
We grapple with the scriptures.
Yeah.
But as I said earlier on, we don't live in a vacuum. Those
Yeah.
scriptures are not delivered to us in a vacuum. Here we live beside this big maunga called Mauao,
Yeah.
right? The incarnation of Jesus and his incarnational mission gives us some kind of an inspiration and some kind of a strategy for seeing that the mission of God, the Missio Dei of God, is actually outworked in flesh and blood in geographical locations.
Yeah.
Not in abstract realities, but actually grappling with the locations and the people amongst whom we dwell.
Yeah.
So we have a theological inquiry,
Yeah.
and therefore we have an historical inquiry,
Yeah.
and we have a geographical inquiry. Who are we? Where do we live?
Yeah.
Who do we live among?
Yes.
And what are the issues that are important to God in the place where we dwell? So this is the grounding of the mission of the gospel. So we use this word, and it's become a bit of a glib term, but it's a journey.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a journey. And as I alluded to before, much of the things we're talking about today have not been given emphasis in the church because we have tended to spiritualize the gospel to things like personal salvation and very important areas, you know, maybe how to bring up a family and all those sorts of things. But we haven't actually understood the ramifications, I think, of this identification with the incarnation of Christ and the incarnation of our mission in the place and the time that we dwell. So what is our context?
Yeah, that's great.
So we look further, and I think we can begin. And we say, where do our feet dwell?
Yeah.
Very simple, actually. Here they dwell on this isthmus here, beside Mauao. What are some of the stories of this land? The stories that actually shape the people, shape the nature of what's happening to the land. And so we begin an inquiry about that. Who is here? Who do we dwell amongst?
Yeah.
What are the issues of the arrival of people here? What is the impact upon the environment of these people here? All of those sorts of questions are the context. And it's a work. And some are called to go into it deeply, and some are just called to maybe reach over the fence and inquire as close as that.
Yeah, yeah, I really like that. I not long ago was in a meeting at a marae, local marae with you, and I saw the mana that you carried with that local iwi and the respect that they had for you, and I thought it was amazing. I thought it was a really amazing thing. Like, how did you start on a journey of connecting with people? And is it just what you're saying? You looked over your fence, or like, tell me a little bit about that journey, maybe.
Yeah, so that's a long journey.
I bet it is. It's all a long journey.
Yeah,
isn't it?
and an ongoing journey, and stumbled into these things really many, many years ago, and stumbled through some of the, as I said, some of the theological questions, grappled around those. Really a person who was raised within what I would call a revivalist background, and that was what our hearts were, to see revival, whatever that means.
Yeah.
But much of it didn't really acknowledge the reality of where we lived. And so I, many, many years ago, was taken to a place called Parihaka, which is in Taranaki, and as a young, naive Pākehā man, was introduced to Te Ao Māori for the Māori world for the first time, and really understood that there was something very different than that. The environment that I'd been raised in, and that there was a story in the land that was also different than the story that I'd been told when I was at school and growing up. So that's been a very long and very precious journey for me, and I am just so grateful for those that have received me along the way and that have overlooked my naivety and my stupidity at times, you know, about these things as I'm in different places around the motu.
Yeah.
So I'm just so indebted to so many Māori older people who many have now passed on, that took me under their wing and gently sometimes chiding me and sometimes just encouraging me and giving me a deeper understanding actually of my own tūranga waiwai as a Tāngata Tiriti and this place to stand, which has given me much greater confidence to know something of who I am as somebody who, in the sovereignty of God, was born in Aotearoa New Zealand.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So, last question, I guess. We're, as a church, as Curate, we have started, but we're embarking on this journey of, toward a more healthy expression of biculturalism as a community of people. Have you got any, I guess, advice or thoughts about how we go about that, or where we begin, I guess, in that journey, that as we kind of set out, I guess to go about this journey in such a way that's really honouring to God, and in a way that would see His kingdom, the influence of God's kingdom, extend beyond where we currently are. It's a big question, eh?
Yeah. The first thing I'd say that we need is courage.
Yeah.
Especially as leaders, because once you open this door, as you probably know, it's a bit of a Pandora's box, and it's not something that you can tightly control and manage.
Yeah.
Why is that? Because you mentioned this term biculturalism. Biculturalism at its heart is the relationship between people.
Yeah, that's right.
Relationships are the most complex things in the world.
Turns
I
out
think.
that's true.
And so we're talking about exploring relationships, a three-dimensional relationship. Ko te atu I runga rawa, our Father who is in heaven, who we are as a person or as an institutional person, and who the other is.
Yeah.
Now you could be, depending who you are, or who that other is.
Yes, that's right.
Let me just say something just briefly about the term biculturalism. It's not something that's always universally accepted. It's again, these are highly contentious terms, but let's just use it for now. The term bi in contrast to the term multiculturalism, because people often would say, oh, we're a multicultural country, which is true. But we've talked about the bicultural foundations of the country in the Treaty of Waitangi. And the term bi is not a term which means only Māori and Pākehā. The bi is Tāngata Whenua and Tāngata Tiriti. Who are Tāngata Tiriti? Tāngata Tiriti are anybody who has come into the land after the settlement of Māori, and who, in my view, come in through the doorway of the treaty. This doorway that gives certain rights and responsibilities to those that come through this doorway. And so you are given this welcome and this right to stand, and also with that right to stand, you have a responsibility as well. So getting back to this question of what do we do? Well, we know the story that we're a part of, begin to uncover that and explore those relationships. And every person, every family, every church institution is different. There is no one size fits all. So for Curate, the journey will be unique. It'll be your own, and it'll be a prayerful journey that hopefully that your leaders will, with courage and with wisdom, help give some pastoral oversight and some prophetic calling into. And those two things are important there because it's a prophetic journey, but it's a journey that needs much pastoral care as well.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing with us. And I actually have a million questions. I just want to keep asking, but I think we better stop there.
Yeah.
But I hope that we can continue this on soon in the future, these conversations. And I just want to thank you for sharing your amazing wisdom and your own journey. I think it's a really beautiful thing. And thank you for going on that journey, and thank you for having that courage and sharing that with us today. It's been amazing.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.